This is seminar talk, which is part of DISC, Digital Society Research Group, and our event. My name is Agdi Kunzman, and I co-lead DISC together with Dan Joseph and Jessica Elias. We've been working for quite a few years on all things digital, all social and humanities research around digital stuff. And we're doing a lot of different exciting things. I won't talk about a lot of them because it's not about me today. It's about our guest speaker, but I'll just very briefly introduce a few key things that we're doing. So one of the things that we're working on is AI literacy, or AI literacies rather, which is a set of conversations that we're having and a set of public engagement events around different literacies in how we engage with AI. We do seminar series, we run summer schools. So if anybody is interested, you can just visit our website, which I'm going to put the link in the chat afterwards. This is just a preview to show you all the events that we're doing. We have events regularly. Some of them are face-to-face on campus, but they're hybrid, means you can tune in, because I think most of our networks and most of our supporters are far away from Manchester. Most of our events are online. So either way, it is always possible to join us. Some of our events are recorded, not all of them, but those that are recorded, we put on our YouTube channel, which is nothing fancy. We're not influencers, but we are a group of really exciting scholars. So we keep it small and intimate, but there is an option to revisit and listen to our talks, and this one is going to be one of them. So we very much hope you keep in touch. I'm going to dump all the relevant links, like our website, our amazing link tree, our YouTube channel, so you can visit. The best thing probably to keep in touch, unless you want to follow us everywhere, is to actually subscribe to Eventbrite, which is where you registered for this event, because any future events that we're going to do are going to be on our Eventbrite and will come up again. And this is it from me. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it to Anne Pasek, who I'm really, really, really delighted, beyond excited to have here. And I've known about Anne's work as part of the environmental media research journal. I think are you on the editorial board of the journal?
I'm co-editor, so if
You're
anybody has
co-editor,
cool
right?
journal articles on these
Which is
subjects, please feel free to talk to me, because I would probably love to publish them.
amazing, amazing, amazing. And it's one of the few journals that actually looks at the relations between media and the environment, digital media and the environment. So when I came across one of Anne's announcements, I of course said, could you please, please, please come and talk to us? So this is all from me. So Anne Pasek is Associate Professor and Canada Research Chair in Media, Culture and Environment at Trent University. She studies the cultural politics of climate change, environmental politics of the big tech. Yes. And the prospects of small tech in contrast. So, Anne, over to you. I'm going to stop sharing and the floor is yours.
All right, here we go. All right, jumping on in here. So thank you so much for being here today. I'm really excited to have a chat with you, and just to sort of give you a map of how I'm gonna divide the time here. There's sort of two parts to this talk. So in the first, I'm going to lay out a case for why I think we should think about so-called AI as a kind of pollution problem, both in terms of its environmental impacts, but also the effects that it's having on our like public information systems, our knowledge commons. Like these are things that I think are worrisome and important to think about together. And I'm going to explore some of the ways that we know what we know about that problem, as well as some of the ways that we don't know quite a lot about it, at least for now. And then I'm going to shift and I'm going to use some of the analytic tools in the field of discard studies to help us sort of rethink that account, and hopefully point to a range of different areas for action that, you know, we in the academy, that policymakers, that activists, that workers might use to address the kind of like AI trash problem from a couple of different angles. So this means that basically I'm going to ping pong across a couple of different forms of harm and like conceptual analogies to think with from fields of study you might assume have nothing to do with AI. But I hope this will all culminate in some really interesting points of synthesis and a really good discussion. But who am I to like talk trash about AI? By way of introduction, as Addie mentioned, I am a media and environmental studies scholar. So my areas of expertise are about the kind of environmental impacts of the information and communication technology sector writ large, how public discourse is about this sector and those problems evolve and are shaped by different stakeholders, including, like just like low carbon, degrowthy experiments and how we might make different kinds of networks or media art that helps us think in different directions. But I also more recently have been doing some collaboration with some corners of the industry. So I'm a consultant with the Sustainable Subsea Networks project, where I'm helping develop some like carbon footprinting tools for the folks that make like underwater subsea cables, the people that make the World Wide Web worldwide. This is all to say that, like, I think digital networks are very important. I think there's real value to being able to share information, to connect across distances, to digitize stuff like this talk we'd otherwise exclusively have to do in person, with a lot of air emissions involved. I like computers, I want them to stay around. I don't want to be the sort of ruthless critic of everything existing all the time. But when I come to AI, as you'll see, I've got some concerns. These concerns are not founded in a depth of knowledge about machine learning, because I cannot code for you a large language model. It's going to be easier for me to read like a financial sheet or an executive speech than to do code reviews. But I have kind of like sort of stumbled into studying people who study machine learning. I'm really interested in what it might mean to decarbonize academic work, and a lot of academic workers are doing compute heavy work in neural nets, in deep learning and so-called AI. And so I've been thinking about what that community thinks about its environmental impacts from the research side of things. I've got a journal article forthcoming in Science and Technology Studies that sort of explores how these researchers have theorized their own climate impacts, and how they think about what a like viable sort of theory of change might be for researchers. And there's lots of like interesting and imperfect organizing attempts being made today. But also, like a lot of us in media studies today, I feel like I'm kind of obliged to have an AI hot take more generally, right? Um, so when pressed, I wrote this short commentary for the Journal of Environmental Media, where I do a bit of a polemic. That's the seed of the ideas I'm going to be developing in this talk today. I've also since expanded some of those in a forthcoming book chapter with Mel Hogan, thinking about the role of AI in like the political economy of the energy transition. So again, like these are all things I'm happy to like geek out with you quite substantively if you would like. Um, but to get us started, you might be wondering, why is trash the frame through which we should approach this problem? And my answer, firstly, is that, I think there is political and social value in derision, right? Especially in the context of hype cycles, right? So we're sort of at this moment where, to many of us, it seems kind of like the AI emperor has no clothes. So we should probably be able to offer some acerbic fashion advice on that front. Also, there's, this like ongoing disconnect between the abstractions of carbon emissions and energy consumption, the lived realities of folks living in the shadow of data centers, and like histories of environmental racism that attend there. So I want to be really stubborn and trying to like keep my analysis of this stuff moving in tandem with like local concerns and planetary registers at the same time. Trash does a little bit of that work for me. But first and maybe finally here, there's this stupid AI trash can that's been haunting me. So it's a product by a Canadian AI startup that promises to, quote, democratize waste wisdom. And like, what the hell does that mean, right? Well, in like an earlier version of this model, Oscar, you sort of wave your hand in front of a sensor that stands in front of a conveyor belt, and then you drop your garbage on the conveyor belt, and a camera with some image recognition software looks at your garbage and decides whether it's garbage or recycling, and then it directs the conveyor belt to like move your waste into one or the other bin. In other versions of this AI trash can, you're going to show your refuse to the camera, and then like a screen will tell you put it in the yellow bin or put it in the blue bin. Hence waste wisdom is democratized. But like many things in our contemporary pivot to AI moment, I think this is just an obviously stupid product, right? Like The first thing is like there's a carbon cost to training these models and running inference on a bunch of data centers on an ongoing basis for the benefit of these cameras. I don't have data on Oscar in particular, but I'm sure we've seen enough headlines about ChatGPT or Gemini to kind of intuitively recognize that this like environmental solution is going to come with an environmental cost built in. So instead of like the carbon-free work of just like thinking for half a second, is what I have in my hand made of plastic? We now have to like run inference on presumably like hundreds of thousands of images a day. And then secondly, like this product is just set up to solve the wrong problem, right? People do not actually have a hard time assessing whether the object in their hands is made of metal or organic materials. Uh, Instead, we have a hard time finding the time to be careful in that assessment, like at every moment of the day. Plus, like, I think a lot of us are kind of a little cynical about the value of recycling. Like, at least here in North America, a lot of that stuff that gets sorted into like plastic recycling ends up in the landfill anyways. And even if that stuff does make it to a recycler, like the net carbon benefit of recycling plastics and glass and paper is, not always guaranteed. So like all in all, this company, Oscar, is just kind of adding friction to a process that people are already kind of fed up with. And you add on top of that the process of training data for image recognition and installing all these cameras and like conveyor belts, right? Those all consume resources. And if those resources don't meaningfully change outcomes, then they themselves are kind of waste. So I'm just like I'm stuck on this trash thing, right? Like the AI trash can itself is trash, and I think this is probably true of a lot of our contemporary experiences with so-called AI. And to give an example, right, like AI is being, well, just to say, like generative language models are being substituted quite a lot for conventional search tools. So for Google, when they subbed in Bard, later Gemini, for their conventional search, we have good estimates that that's about 10 times more energy intensive, right? So like an order of magnitude worse. And I don't believe you can opt out of AI overviews on Google anymore, right? And we know that this is just being sort of rolled out on a wider number of topics and regions as sort of the default way of doing internet search on a platform that's basically secured a monopoly globally. So, maybe ChatGPT will succeed in sort of wrestling some of that market share away from Google, but if it does so, it will be with an even more carbon intensive product, right? Like these are old stats, but a couple of years back, we had a good guess that ChatGPT was, a further 10 times worse than Google LLMs. So this is to say that we're sort of adding waste to a system without meaningfully changing its outcomes. And, one thing that I want to stress is that waste isn't just a question of carbon emissions. It's also a matter of polluting our informational environment. So the first symptom of informational pollution we might think of as spam. So in a commercial internet where attention gets monetized, there is a real financial incentive to just mass produce crap in the hope that you can catch some eyeballs with SEO garbage. And there's also a huge amount of AI slop, so-called, delightfully, much of which is designed to be purposefully nonsensical because its lack of meaning or its frustration of meaning is itself attention grabbing, right? We want to understand and resolve what is fundamentally nonsense. So there's a problem with the quantity of stuff that's out there, and a problem with like the amount of noise in this corpus. And so paradoxically, that can drive people to use so-called AI tools in information seeking because hopefully, like ChatGPT will be like a little more attention sparing than the experiences that increasingly characterize the open web. But in many cases, so-called AI is a worse search tool because these language models are just really confident liars, right? These lies can be innocuous, such as mangling the number of R's in the word strawberry, or they can be more subtle and consequential, such as stating that only a minority of signatories to the Declaration of Independence owned slaves. Right? Like that's incorrect, and that's a bad error to make. Of course, there's also just like a huge amount of scams on these tools or facilitated by them. And the question of kind of like constantly reinforcing stereotypes and social bias in their outputs, I'm sure you folks have run into like the growing amount of scholarship on those topics. But like all in all, right? Like I think this is not good for society, right? This is a sort of pollution of our informational commons. Um, and this, of course, rebounds also in spaces which we formally understand to be informational commons, whether that is peer-reviewed publications or publicly managed data archives. So, maybe y'all have experienced this in the classroom. For me as a journal editor, right, that work of being an editor, of being a teacher is getting even more thankless as like the slop floods our gates. Sometimes it's obviously wrong, like the case of this really weird scientific diagram of rat testicular stem cells. This is generated by a bot, and it is all kinds of wrong. Though this one did make it past peer review and into publication, so that's worrying. In other cases, it's a little more ambiguous, like Wikipedia editors have been trying to build AI detection tools and like not prohibitions, but like a culture of saying no into Wikipedia authorship. Though like they're sort of increasingly concerned that this isn't happening as quickly as sort of like AI emboldened authors are kind of storming their gates and just adding a lot of trash. So that's a problem. Uh, Further to this point, I wonder if something similar is happening in law. Like we're beginning to see the rise of court filings that contain fictional case information. And there have been some like splashy fines and some sharp words from some judges recently, but that's only in cases where that stuff has gotten caught. And sort of like the horrible rat image, I do worry about the stuff that's probably slipping in. I am, of course, not a legal expert, but we can sort of understand law in many ways as like a giant citational chain where the integrity of one link is predicated on like the interpretation of all the ones that precede it. And there are like long-term consequences to informational pollution in that system, right? If false case law becomes cited and accepted, those reversals can get quite muddy and difficult to undo. So here you can see an excerpt from an email from Morgan and Morgan, which is a personal injury firm in the States, making it clear to lawyers in the firm that, synthetic text will contain falsehoods and you have to rigorously verify everything it offers. The analogy here, I guess, is to failing to catch fictional case law. It's the same way as failing to catch a case reversal. And it seems like we're on the precipice of just sort of like a rising number of those failures, and folks are rightfully quite anxious. Another thing that really interests me about this AI trash problem is that it's also a problem for AI researchers. So our dominant model of building so-called AI, relies on just sort of throwing an increasing exponential volume of training data and compute at these systems. And this is why, AI companies are more or less indiscriminately collecting all the data they can, regardless of consent or copyright, because, like linear advances require exponentially more input to get there. It's outpacing Moore's law. It's really quite worrying. And the problem now, of course, is that like a lot of those data sources are themselves now contaminated with AI trash. And AI trash is not good for young AI minds. If you keep training models on generative outputs, you can get what people call model collapse. You could sort of think about this as like the machine learning equivalent of like audio feedback. It isn't pretty. There's been some speculation that this is why OpenAI's ChatGPT-5 launch was so underwhelming. Maybe they've kind of poisoned the digital well of their product, such that the mass scraping of the internet to get new data is much less useful than it used to be. And, in this community, in a way that I find quite interesting, people sort of speak about like a boundary condition in the history of the internet, like we would if we were paleontologists discussing like a golden spike in geologic history. There's like a before and an after to the release of ChatGPT into the world, and we're kind of in this post-lapsarian world. There's an artist called Tiga Brain who just released a project called Slop Evader, that allows you to basically just search the internet, but exclusively returning results pre-2023. So again, like we're kind of finding these really extreme ways of cutting across this trash problem. And this all kind of culminates into a big metaphor for me that maybe we're sort of witnessing the equivalent of the introduction of a new pollutant into our cultural and informational systems, which also does happen to come with actual pollution to local air and global climate all at the same time. And the analogy I've been thinking about is single-use plastic. And I am not the only one to use that connection. So we have the kind of rise of single-use text and disposable images. This is how most systems handle requests, right? Even when you're having a conversation with a chatbot, it is simply sending your entire conversation history to get crunched for a novel input every single time. When you're generating pictures, you're generating tens of them and throwing them all away, save for the one that you might use in a really ephemeral sense. And so, I think just like petrochemical companies in the 1950s, didn't think too far about the long-term waste and public health crises their products were going to produce over the course of many lifetimes, lifetimes longer than their own. I wonder if we have a parallel problem here with novel informational and climate pollution. So let's explore that problem. Normally when I'm speaking to a new audience about climate and tech stuff, I have to do like a lot of scaffolding work. I've got to, sometimes explicitly lay out the digital isn't immaterial. The cloud is just someone else's computer. And all that computational work that we talk about, like that requires minerals and energy, and that all plays like a larger and larger role in determining our climate futures. However, I think it's safe to say that the cat is out of the bag when it comes to so-called AI, right? There's just like many news stories and polemics out there about the fact that this stuff comes with energy and carbon emissions. And generally, that story is one of quantity, right? Like the numbers are large, they are shocking. Maybe we will boil the oceans. Oh no. And when we do talk about actions people can take in relation to this environmental information, usually that public conversation only talks about like personal consumption. So like there's often like a set of tips for everyday people to minimize the carbon impact of one's AI use. I don't think these tips are actually that impactful in the grand scheme of things. I think they're probably more about like palliating feelings of guilt rather than trying to secure like a genuinely different social or material relation with the technology or the tech companies themselves. And so when we talk about informational pollution, that other side of the coin, I think there's an acknowledgement that this stuff can be frustrating, but maybe also kind of humorous and absurd. And as such, like we might relate to it as a phenomenon we might learn to tolerate, or we could at least like feel better about ourselves for being smarter than the chatbots and synthetic image extruders. Uh, Alternatively, we might respond to the problem with education, right? Like maybe it's just a matter of training people to become better detectives. This is often something that's spoken about in the language of AI literacy, and I'm really curious to know what the research group's been making of that term. Um, I think like it's an obvious good, but it's also less obviously sometimes a kind of subject of tech company darlings, right? There's this sometimes presumption that if we, just like build more ethical AI, or if we retroactively patch the models that have been publicly circulating, right, we could solve the bias problem. If we train up enough people to have an acute skeptical view, like we don't have to sort of worry that much about the pollution issue. And have you considered like we could use AI to combat bias going forward, right? There's that kind of like double-edged sword motif that's often part of this conversation, but like maybe let's only focus on the side of the sword that's pointed the other way. And as you can tell, like the environmental problems in AI, I'm really dissatisfied with this kind of framing in general, right? Like, I think it's really reactive. It's centered on individual consumers without really giving an account of all the different players and forces in these systems. And it presumes that so-called AI is a given that we have to just personally manage, adapt to, reactively coexist with. And I just think that gives way too much away from the start. So let's take a more systematic view of what's going on here. This means that we've got to start with what we don't know, which is to say how models are trained and weighted, how much compute, and with what kinds of energy and water and carbon implications, in what regional grids and watersheds really matter in assessing the precise environmental impact of these technologies. And the bad news is, overwhelmingly, we do not have that data. Estimates do exist, but such figures are partial and contingent. We only really get a glimpse of what might be that total energy usage figure. So the organizations best placed to produce like an energy or supply chain inventory, companies like Meta, Microsoft, and OpenAI, they simply aren't sharing relevant information. They're real tight-lipped. And their regular environmental impacting reporting takes great pains not to include AI-specific figures. And, like a year back, under the Biden administration, in the US, there was a plan to create a voluntary framework for these kinds of disclosures. But Donald Trump repealed that, I think, in like the first 24 hours of his presidency. So probably at the behest of some big donors. And that means that we're just really not likely to get grounded information on this problem from the biggest players in the next 3 years at least. Um, so, this is a problem because if we want to sort of pursue this matter through environmental law, for instance, we need to have like good empirical data to back up our legal claims. But we are stuck in a context where we have to figure out how to act without that precision. And I will say there are rare cases where a company does offer some data, but in those cases, it's almost always quite cunningly selective. So Google, for example, recently shared that a single Gemini query, or rather the median case of its user base, emits about 0.03 grams of CO2. That's the equivalent of watching like 9 seconds of TV. That sounds pretty small. But that doesn't actually tell us that much of anything at all about different use cases of Gemini, right? There could be some really weird, like long tail effects stuff afoot that the very carefully scoped median case ignores. And it doesn't also tell us the effects of Gemini as a system, as a whole, right? Because it's something new, right? It's creating consumption where there didn't used to be any. And so it is that kind of like additionality that is, I think, the story that's really worth telling. We can sort of, intuit, like I mentioned, what that answer might be. One way to get there would be to take an open source model, train it up yourself, and just be really meticulous in counting all the energy you use to achieve that task. So Sasha Lucioni at Hugging Face is like a big figure in this line of inquiry. Her work is great. This is a bit of a capture from a paper where she and some colleagues explored Bloom, which is a synthetic text LLM. And they found that just training Bloom generated 50 tons of CO2e in the 118-day training run that it required. But also just keeping Bloom online emitted greenhouse gases equivalent to driving like 49 miles in an average gas-powered car. Every day you'd take your car out for a drive just to keep this relatively smaller language model up and running. And then you can kind of extrapolate from that case to think about, if there's this many parameters in this system, what does it look like when we scale up to something like ChatGPT-3? If we do that, we'll say, well, it's actually 500 tons of carbon dioxide produced during training alone. And this is, again, like an exceedingly old model. ChatGPT is now like fragmented its numbering system, but we're sort of several generations ahead of this with, again, exponentially more data and compute sort of thrown at these things. So we can make guesses, right? And it's sort of safe to assume that these guesses are on the conservative side, right? Like if these scholars were dramatically wrong, we can assume that companies would come out and correct them, right? Like that is kind of the incentive that they have in this space. Another indicator we have of this direction of travel is the overall environmental disclosures of tech companies. So since 2021, we've seen almost all of our sort of Magnificent Seven companies just totally belly flop on their existing sustainability pledges, explicitly because of their AI investments. So Google has a goal, had a goal maybe, it's disappeared from their website, of cutting its climate pollution in half by 2030, compared to a 2019 baseline. Its total emissions have actually grown by 48% since 2019. Microsoft, which is a company I spend a lot of time studying, its emissions are up 30% by 2020. This is a problem because it has a moonshot of being carbon negative by 2030, and its sort of AI era isn't helping. Its CEO now estimates that that goal of being carbon negative is like 5 times further away than when it was first set. So this is the picture that repeats across these companies, right? Emissions are aggressively increasing rather than falling, as they had hoped they would at the start of the decade. And just to belabor what might be an obvious point here, the reason why these corporations are failing all their climate pledges is that they are rapidly building many more data centers to provide the computational infrastructure for these so-called AI tools. So Microsoft has this like entangled infrastructural and capital relationship with OpenAI. You know, their $100 billion data center Stargate was a very splashy announcement, but then it was rapidly overtaken by Amazon, which has pledged like 150 billion on new data center construction for the next decade, specifically for AI. So things are booming. Things are really weird. Like you may have heard that AI data center capital expenditures are higher than like all domestic consumer spending in the American economy in 2025. Um, this is so inflated that it may actually be disguising signals of an inflationary crisis in the American economy. Like that should have us all pretty worried. Um, Also troublesome is the effect that all this build out has had and will have on the electrical grid. So national and international forecasts vary, but they all kind of point to some pretty sizable spikes. Some estimate that data centers could consume like 9% or even 20% of all electricity consumed in the American grid by the end of the decade. And the American grid does not have the infrastructure or generation capacity to accommodate that. This is especially acute in some like hyper concentrated communities like Virginia. There's just like this disproportionate clustering of data centers in these zones. For folks in the UK, right, like the equivalent here would be Ireland, where data centers energy demand there is like predicted to be like a third of the country's energy capacity by 2030. It's already something around 20%, I think. So for people who are living like in data center city, it's not uncommon to see consumer energy bills increase. And this is because in most energy markets, the cost to improve and maintain grid infrastructure gets shared by all ratepayers in a service area. So if a data center shows up in your city, and it needs like a new transformer station and like a high voltage transmission line to get put in, everyone who has a power bill pays for that, including everyday consumers on your monthly power bill. So in some analyses, we're already looking at a price hike in like the tens of dollars per month range in these like hyper hit markets like PJM in Virginia. And that obviously exacerbates like a cost of living crisis that I think most of the population is still feeling, and it's just a really clear economic justice problem. And in the long term, right, like this kind of constraint on energy demand, or rather the intensification of it, right, that can check out into longer issues with like grid health. So increased rates of brownouts, possible blackouts, and then all the kind of like attendant public inconveniences and like legitimate threats to public safety and public health. However, on the industry side, conversely, like this demand problem currently means that energy is a limiting factor to how fast the sector can build out its AI infrastructure. So to put that another way, like the tech sector wants to build many more data centers than it is currently able to. Its aggressive rates of growth are limited by finite energy supply. And this means that a lot of clean energy pledges are being abandoned, like Google taking theirs off their website. And also, a lot of fossil assets on the grid are finding new buyers. So just to give a few examples here, in Kansas City, the life of a coal plant was extended by 5 years, in large part to power a Meta data center. In Virginia, there's been many, many data centers that Dominion Energy, the local grid operator, um, has sort of been reporting on to its investors and saying this is fantastic. We can actually make like substantive like expansions to our gas generation fleet to meet this demand, and maybe we should consider retiring this coal plant. Just overall, right? There's this now a global shortage of gas turbines. You can't buy one now for the next 3 or 4 years because they're all backlogged in this sort of gold rush for gigawatts. And looking closer again at some of these communities, we find a lot of local land use conflicts. The picture that emerges is that data centers are often very bad neighbors. So in places where data centers get clustered, again, like Ireland, Virginia, we could also look at the Netherlands, Singapore, Chile, and France. Like, people are just increasingly unhappy with the bargain that local leaders strike with data center operators. People don't like the impact on their energy bills and grid stability. People don't like the way they're taking up farmland and like space for housing in urban areas in exchange for what, functionally looks a lot like an empty box that doesn't generate a lot of jobs. Um, People are worried that these data centers will overdraw local water resources, particularly in arid regions, right? Like if it's tapping into like underground aquifers, we're looking at maybe like a permanent loss in those groundwater reserves. And people really hate the noise, right? Depending on how it's configured, living next to one of these things can be genuinely nightmarish. There are fans that produce low frequency noise just absolutely 24/7, and there are not good standards for ensuring that like minimal, like neighborly noise pollution statutes are followed there in design. And just to belabor the point here, I want to bring us to one specific case study, that of Colossus, which is a hyperscale data center that came online in Memphis, Tennessee in 2024. It's possibly the world's largest AI data center. It costs something in the ballpark of $1 billion to build, and it features what will be eventually a total of about 1 million GPUs. Those GPUs are going to have like maybe a 3 or 5 year lifespan because they're going to be running at full tilt for the duration of their short life. This facility currently needs more electricity than the local grid can supply. So the company installed a fleet of 30 portable gas generators, like each about the size of like a big rig truck, that burn methane gas 24/7 on the site to just up its power. This is very bad for the climate, right? We don't love that. But it's especially bad for local public health. And the facility has like about 20 more generators running here than the company initially was approved for in its permit. Um, and so, like, investigative journalists actually had to uncover the whole thing using a drone and thermal imaging. And, the amount of energy that's being used here is like the equivalent of 3% of the state's entire electrical grid. So it's like moving a utility scale gas plant into the neighborhood. And that neighborhood is majority Black, with a long history of dealing with the effects of environmental racism. So asthma rates are already quite elevated in the community because of prior air pollution problems. This is all being legally contested, but the company's position is that because they are only using temporary mobile assets in these like truck generators, as long as they aren't running for like less than 365 days in the same location, they like just fundamentally shouldn't be subject to any of the air pollution laws that obtain federally. So that's quite horrible. And if you didn't already pick up on this, that company is Elon Musk's xAI. And all this pollution is for the benefit of training and inferencing Grok, which is X's in-suite so-called AI chatbot. And that brings us back to this like informational layer of the AI trash problem, right? Like this whole complex exists just so this company can offer a product that's less woke and like certainly less risk adverse when it comes to copyright and defamation than other so-called AI companies. This has further degraded the informational environment of the internet. And I'm not only talking about that one weird day where Grok kept talking about white genocide entirely unbidden. So, it's a pretty outrageous example. So much so that I think it's fair to ask, like, whether these environmental concerns in Memphis would be circulating as widely or that they would land as like poignantly as I hope they are, if they weren't also associated with a product that's like so sloppy and racist and polarizing and stupid. Um, but the story of Grok seems like a clear signal, at least to me, that like there's really a lack of regulatory scrutiny or frameworks that prevent like the worst actors of operating in this space, let alone like constrain or shape the behaviors of the merely average ones. So I think we've got a pollution problem here, again, on a few different registers. And pollution is a tricky thing, both sociologically and materially. So previously, I made the analogy to plastics pollution, right? We've got this sort of novel material, new technology that's producing a range of harms that we don't know how to effectively manage. And there's a risk that it could become, kind of integrated into daily life to the point that it seems impossible to get rid of or substitute, let alone to remediate the harms it's already created. And unfortunately, unlike conventional forms of pollution, the prospect of getting like clear environmental data on LLMs and then like suing a bunch of companies under existing environmental laws, again, like I don't think that looks likely. Um, However, there are still many ways that we can shape this system and know this system, both from above and below. And like, I think this is maybe the real dividend of thinking through discard studies as an academic field, right? Like, we have a way of doing cultural and political analyses of waste systems, and I think they apply here. So discard studies has got some pretty good insights. Firstly, it offers an analysis of how we can think about discarding practices as a way to understand and diagnose wider systems, how those systems maintain their structures, and therefore, like, basically how power functions in like material and social arrangements, wherever you find trash. Secondly, it encourages us to be suspicious about the categories we inherit for knowing waste, because quite often these are like unhelpfully general. They need to be disaggregated. And finally, it encourages us to scrutinize the way that waste problems get framed in the first place, because different vantage points within that wider system can sort of like open or close different analytic doors. So to give an example of these principles in action, I'm going to run through this very quickly by looking at plastics, right? So we can understand how access to disposable packaging, right? Plastic wrappers, plastic bags, all that has been kind of integral to the rise of new cultural and logistical forms, and also like new ways of concentrating capital across global supply chains, right? Plastic burger boxes are also like secretly a story about power. Um, but this is also true for the discards of these systems, right? Like most plastics get landfilled domestically, where they can cause environmental issues for local neighborhoods, or they get exported often to Asia for maybe recycling, if they make it there with a with a low degree of contamination. They might eventually get, incinerated or melted down into like lower grade material. This all produces environmental burdens that get absorbed by distant populations and landscapes. And a lot of authors out there will tell you, this all looks pretty colonial. Secondly, we've got to complicate our categories, right? Like there's so many different kinds of plastic that we actually have like dramatically different environmental and public health profiles. Some plastics we can hypothetically have like a decent shot at recycling. Some we absolutely can't. Nevertheless, the plastics industry like keeps putting the same recycling symbols on them in a way that confuses pretty much everybody about the truth of the matter. It makes us think of plastics as like a singular thing, right? Undifferentiated and all recyclable. Um, Similarly, like when we think about use cases, there's like a range of different technical and moral factors at play, right? We probably want to keep single-use plastics in hospitals, right? Long after we've abandoned them in food packaging, right? Just to give one example. So the fact that public discourse keeps happening through the generic category of plastics is itself a barrier to having like the nuance that we need to be able to make like different choices and different actions. Thirdly, and importantly, right, we should understand that plastics recycling is a story of regulatory capture. This really complicates whether or not we should see recycling as a clear moral good. The modern recycling system was actually created by the beverage industry to avoid regulations that would make them responsible for end-of-life costs for like bottles and cans. Instead, there was a concentrated public relations effort to reframe the problem as one of bad individual actions through the figure of the litter bug. Um, so, a classic story of trying to individualize systemic problems, or at least like muddy the waters of like who's responsible and what would an appropriate solution look like. What should we think and not think about on that horizon of possibilities? Another part of the problem is that this like emphasis on the consumer ends up ignoring pretty much all non-consumer facing waste practices. And this means that we lose sight of the forest for like the particular tree that we have closest at hand. So, like for instance, like some of the more famous plastic waste problems, like the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, seem to be mostly an effect of the fishing industry rather than anything that people do or don't put on a recycling bin next to the coast, right? Like beach cleanups aren't the solution here. It's industry regulation that's like the going to be the fulcrum that matters. So again, this is our like discard studies account of plastic. We got to think about systems. We got to disaggregate our categories. We got to think about power. So let's take this account and run a so-called AI through this sort of gauntlet of analysis. How is the story of AI? One about how power works. Um, Certainly the way the sector's allied itself with the Trump administration is like a bit of an object lesson in regulatory capture, right? The Americans are unlikely to do much in the way of policy development or enforcement on all of the open myriad legal questions that AI is raising, in part because there are just like naked corruption happening, dollars changing hands to grease favors. But and that's maybe all, like not too terribly mysterious. But I also want to focus on the larger question of what's actually motivating the tech sector itself in their embrace of AI boosterism, right? Like, why are they wasting so much money on products that aren't actually making them a return on investment and whose outputs are, just really trashy? There's like a lot of potential explanations out there, but one that I think is particularly compelling is the end to the zero interest rate phenomena. Like there's that sort of post-pandemic shift in the investment landscape. The pandemic caused inflation, which led to an unexpected end of like favorable borrowing rates. Um, this was a pretty significant factor for the tech sector, which had enjoyed like decades of venture capital interest because if you can, make more money sinking things into tech stocks, or even better, into like looking for a unicorn company than you can with conventional financial instruments. That's really great if you are a coder with a garage and a dream, or if you are a well-financed monopoly power who can, deliver a growth stock rather than a static one. But when that all goes away, right, like the sector contracts, bigger players consolidate, and the pursuit of monopoly looks a little bit different. There's clearly been the case where like formerly quite elite tech workers are losing their relative power within companies, and automation just becomes far more attractive to management, and it offers the opportunity to, cut workforces or de-skill them or slow down, speed up work. So I stand with a growing number of scholars here who are pretty convinced that this bargain holds true even beyond the walls of the tech sector itself, right? There's probably like your fair share of CEOs with like ill-placed FOMO, or CTOs who just fundamentally misunderstand what so-called AI can technically achieve for their company. Um, but I also bet that there's like a lot of people who know that simply the threat of automation or the ability to speed up and de-skill like knowledge work, that just like nicely solidifies the power of management, even if there's like a dip in quality in the process. So as Kate Crawford argues, right, like this is something that we entirely miss when we only talk about the problems here as problems of sustainability or of ethics or of literacy. So we do need a really different set of political analyses and tactics if we understand the question as one concerned with who has power in the workplace or in political systems. And I go back to Memphis, right? Like these questions of power are also imbricated in legacies of racism and colonialism. There's really interesting work emerging on these questions as these scholars like map out historic and geographic patterns. History, it turns out, is repeating itself through the waste practices of digital systems. And if we look outside the US, particularly to the global south, there's also the issue of the largely racialized and global south data workers who are involved in cleaning traded data sets and like managing disturbing content questions after all those models get hastily released. That is also a question about the legacies of colonialism and racial capitalism in our world system. And again, like something that an emphasis on bias or ethics or efficiency like entirely misses. Secondly, I think there's a real need for our scholarship to stop treating all algorithmic systems as like a messy bundle of artificial intelligence. Like these words ultimately mean very little, and they are as confusing as the moniker of plastic when it comes to trying to develop like an environmental politics that can actually get some traction on the issue. So like I won't even go into the question here whether or not like AI can do some good things too, because posing that question is just a direct effect of our semantic confusion in this space. Just like I don't want to ban medical plastic, I also don't want to ban custom-built protein folding machine learning tools. Like those are cool, they can stay. But let's not let the existence of like a relatively narrow set of socially useful applications custom built for problems with expert guidance to prevent us from apprehending and constraining the overwhelming amount of trash that's coming from, these generative models, right? There's like a really, really important environmental and social benefit to being able to build up that distinction. Finally, and I've already sung some of these verses in the song here, but I do overall want to encourage us to de-emphasize consumer behavioral choices or environmental virtues and think much more often about system level actors, right? So like Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk's decisions just matter way more than my students do. And I really worry that an environmental politics built around like shaming people for using so-called AI or encouraging them to prompt better, that might look a lot like Keep America Beautiful, right? Working real hard to generate emotions and like moral claims about litter practice, only about the parts of the systems we interact with, like at the expense of regulating the system as a whole. So it's worth keeping in mind that like a lot of these so-called AI uses today, it's induced demand. It's created by companies forcing the adoption of products into existing applications without consumer interest or consent. And there's just like a huge amount of non-user facing systems that we ignore if we are only worried about reducing the impact of like our personal chat GPT use. So that's the system we want to shape, right? How do we do that? And through what wider set of leverage points than just like changing our own behavior or relying on environmental law as it already exists to come in and regulate. One place I think to look is organized labor. So a huge source of optimism for me is the 2023 SAG-AFTRA strike. This was the Hollywood writers and also animators going out on the picket line, and they won really meaningful and important restrictions against AI in their contracts. It was a big improvement for their job security and work environment, which is great for them. It's also great for us because it proves that it can be done, right? So my faculty union just got similar language into our contract, which basically states that we can't be forced to use AI tools if we don't want to, and our material cannot be used to train further models. And I would love to see more sectors try to give that a try. It's an example of what Blair Tard Frost calls AI counter-governance, and I think it's a trajectory that we should think more about as the possibilities, again, for like federal legislation probably remain elusive in the corridors of power where these companies are headquartered. A less organized but plenty interesting form of labor action comes in the form of algorithmic sabotage, right? So kind of like a digital Ludditism in the proper historical sense, with a lively group of artists and researchers working on ways to punish AI scrapers that steal their content to train models. And these are definitely the weapons of the weak, right? It's not clear to what extent this is a threat that's meaningful to large LLM companies, but it might offer at least like some degree of sanctuary or retribution to digital creators engaging in this experiment. And also, and this is a point more for the EU than for North Americans, but I'm really interested in what it might mean to go after the enabling conditions for the AI slop, rather than just trying to regulate the slop factory after it has been so enabled. So this means getting serious about privacy and copyright law, and thus fundamentally revising the kind of social contracts that underpinned the attention economy of the internet that's characterized our century so far. So the EU GDPR is, I think, a really good step in that direction. The Digital Services Act is another. Those details are still being worked out, but basically, like there are some forces in Brussels that are trying to ensure that like meaningful, measurable consent about the collection and sale of personal data counts when it comes to model training, such that potentially, like if you use illegal data to train your model will not be legal to use. It's not perfect, but it is miles ahead of the North American regulatory landscape, and it's clearly aggravating to JD Vance and tech billionaires, which I think is a sign that we're probably on to something. And of course, you might have heard in November there were some EU Commission documents that got leaked, suggesting that like there might actually be some step backs in the future. It's not clear how this contest will play out, right? Like there, you would need to pull together a pretty large coalition to get there, and that's not guaranteed. So I just include this to say, like, it's important not to take any of this for granted, and I think it's important to rally in defense of the standards that are already there. The battle is very much ongoing. The future is unwritten, and it turns out, if you want to think about like what is the feedstock that then becomes AI slop, thinking about privacy might be a way to sort of intervene in that wider supply chain. So with that, I am going to wrap things up here and open up for questions. I'm really quite interested to chat with you all to hear what your thoughts are on trash prop